Alright, here to do weekly Tuesday reading stream. And of course, I will be continuing to read. Where did I put it? Here. Continue reading COVID-19, The Great Reset. So, just wanted to start with talking about a couple of things. Okay. The whole stream up on YouTube so I can see how it's going. The date. So just before it started, oh, um, so I released a Vanguard digest on my Substack uh, last Saturday, and my current intention is to record a video, sort of, or like make a video, uh, make a video sort of translating that article into video form. I may write another digest this week to release on Saturday uh, about White Australia, the new party that has been started by the National Socialist Network in Australia. So it's a neo-Nazi party, effectively. Uh, so if I do another digest on that, then I'll try and sort of make a video on that one as well. Yeah, that is my current intention to try and turn digests into videos. Uh, so yeah, just keep an eye out for that one. I'll give updates. And on Thursday, of course, we'll be playing Sonic Racing Cross Worlds. Now, I will not be playing it fresh on Thursday. I don't know if there is a story mode, but I will probably be just sort of playing. I'll probably start playing it after the stream, to be honest, because early access started today. Um, and for Thursday, I intend to get some drink Get some alcohol and gut. So drink driving and a racing game. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, I'll just wipe this back up. Okay. So in the last reading stream, I started reading chapter 1. Now, I can tell that this is going to take a while. Just chapter 1 alone is going to take some time to get through because it is pretty long, constituting, by the looks of it, over basically half the fucking book is chapter 1. Um, Split into a crap ton of smaller headers and smaller headers and yeah, all of that. Well, let's get started. So last time I finished off, I'm up to 1.2.2, growth and unemployment. So right. Before March 2020, never had the world economy come to such an abrupt and brutal stop. Never before had anyone alive experienced an economic collapse so dramatic and drastic, both in its nature and pace. The shock that the pandemic has inflicted on the global economy has been more severe and has occurred much faster than anything else in recorded economic history. Even in the Great Depression of the early 1930s and the global financial crisis in 2008, it took several years for GDP to contract by 10% or more and for unemployment to soar above 10%. With the pandemic, disaster like macroeconomic outcomes, in particular exploding unemployment levels and plunging GDP growth, happened in March 2020 over the course of just 3 weeks. COVID-19 inflicted a crisis of both supply and demand that led to the deepest dive on record for the global economy for over 100 years. As the economist Kenneth Rogoff warned, everything depends on how long it lasts. But if this goes on for a long time, it's certainly going to be the mother of all financial crises. The length and acuteness of the downturn and its subsequent hit to growth and employment depend on three things: the duration and severity of the outbreak, two, each country's success at containing the pandemic and mitigating its effects, and three, the cohesiveness of each society in dealing with the post confinement measures and the various opening strategies. At the time of writing, end of June 2020, All three aspects remain unknown. Renewed waves of outbreaks, big and small, are occurring. Countries' success at containing the outbreak can either last or suddenly be reversed by new waves, and society's cohesion can be challenged by renewed economic and social pain. So, so how did it really go? Like, so the duration and severity of, well, it kind of went for 3 years. It kind of only started to die down like at the end of 2022. Um, each country's success at containing the pandemic and mitigating its effects. I mean, China seems to have done the best by far. The United States did the worst. Let's say that much. Yeah, China did the best because of the authoritarian measures that were put into place. Whereas Trump, in particular, was just kind of like, at the end of his first term, he was just kind of like, "Fuck it, let's get everybody back to work because we need to get the economy going again," while the while the outbreak was still going on. So that just exacerbated the problem. And as for the third point, at least in the West, it exacerbated polarization quite massively. In fact, it very much exacerbated problems. We're seeing it today. It's a rough time living in. um, we're up to another section: economic growth. At different moments between February and May 2020, in a bid to contain the pandemic, governments worldwide made the deliberate decision to shut down much of their respective countries. This unprecedented course of events has brought with it a fundamental shift in the way the world economy operates, marked by an abrupt and unsolicited return to a form of relative autarky, with every nation trying to move towards certain forms of self sufficiency and a reduction in national and global output. This has sort of continued. We have seen a relative swing back towards economic nationalism since the pandemic. That has been noticeable. Um, Even in Australia, ironically, like elsewhere, um, elsewhere in the world, like I mean, like in America, for instance, it's predominantly been the Republicans who have pushed the sort of economic nationalist shift, whereas the Democrats upheld the sort of the neoliberal globalist status quo. Um, I'm not sure about too many other countries, but at least in Australia, I've seen in some respect the response to the pandemic or this sort of or the shift to some sort of economic nationalism kind of mimics what um kind of mimics how the shift to neoliberalism is handled in Australia. Like, whereas in other countries, it tended to be like the right wing parties who would institute neoliberal policies, like Reagan in America, Thatcher in the UK. In Australia, which I think was actually the first, it was the Labor Party, the nominally centre-left party, which instituted neoliberalism with Bob Hawke, um, and the subsequent Labor government with Paul Keating. Whereas today, it seems like the um, the Liberal National Coalition uh, seem to, for the most part, uphold the globalized um, status quo, whereas the Albanese government has started to shift towards returning some domestic production. um, it's not nearly as stark. Um, like it is still definitely like it is trying to find a sort of compromise between the neoliberal status quo and bringing back some domestic industry. Uh, like I've heard something about they're trying to bring back, I think something to do with like solar panel components. Um, Bringing some of that back. Um, so it's definitely not as stark a shift with the Labour Party, but it does seem to be that Labour prioritised economic nationalism more than the Liberals. In the same respect, though, the minor right wing parties, mainly like Pauline Hanson's One Nation and Gerard Rennick's People First Party, they have been the main ones who have pushed a stronger economic nationalism. Um, in Rennick's case, it is more explicitly protectionist. In Pauline Hanson's case, it's not as explicitly protectionist, but there is more of a focus on it than there is with the Labour Party. So Rennick is certainly like a more outward protectionist in that respect. So yeah, that's definitely a shift that has been taking place that has continued. Uh, so yeah, I'll just continue reading. The impact of these decisions seemed all the more dramatic because they concerned first and foremost service industries, a sector traditionally more immune than other industries like construction or manufacturing to the cyclical swings of economic growth. Consequently, the service sector that represents by far the largest component of economic activity in any developed economy, about 70% of GDP and more than 80% of employment in the US, was hit the hardest by the pandemic. It also suffered from another distinctive characteristic. Contrary to manufacturing or agriculture, lost revenues in services are gone forever. They cannot be deferred because service companies don't hold inventories or stock raw materials. Several months into the pandemic, it looks like even a semblance of a return, business as usual, for most service companies is inconceivable as long as COVID-19 remains a threat to our health. This in turn suggests that a full return to normal cannot be envisaged before a vaccine is available. When might that be? According to most experts, it is unlikely to be before the first quarter of 2021 at the earliest. In mid-June 2020, already more than 135 trials were underway, proceeding at a remarkable pace, considering that in the past it could take up to 10 years to develop a vaccine, 5 in the case of Ebola. So the reason is not science, but production. So I think the vaccine started rolling out in 2021, which meant that the main thing that kept it chugging along was the higher transmission rate of the Omicron variant. That was the main thing that kept it going longer. Um, yeah, Omicron was significantly more transmissible than than um, than Delta was. Although even Delta, I think, was more transmissible than the original, than the Alpha strain. Um, the Delta strain was more dangerous, though, if I recall. The Delta strain was more dangerous and more transmissible. The Omicron variant was less dangerous than Delta, but more transmissible. So, and it was likely that higher transmission which kept it going despite the vaccines getting rolled out in 2021. Manufacturing billions of doses constitutes the real challenge that will require a massive expansion diversion of existing capacity. The next hurdle is the political challenge of vaccinating enough people worldwide. We are collectively as strong as the weakest link, with a high enough compliance rate despite the rise of anti-vaxxers. During the intervening months, the economy will not operate at full capacity, a country-dependent phenomenon dubbed the 80% economy. Companies in sectors as varied as travel, hospitality, retail, or sports and events will face the following triple whammy. One, fewer customers who will respond to uncertainty by becoming more risk averse. Two, those who consume will spend less on average because of precautionary savings. And three, transaction costs will be higher. Serving one customer will cost more because of physical distancing sanitation measures. Taking into account the criticality of services for GDP growth, the richer the country, the greater the importance of services for growth, which I think is because a lot of the traditional production ends up getting exported by the rich countries. Um, this new reality of an 80% economy begs the question of whether successive possible shutdowns of business activity in the service sector will have lasting effects on the broader economy through bankruptcies and loss of employment, which in turn begs the question of whether these possible lasting effects could be followed by a collapse in demand as people lose their income and their confidence in the future. Such a scenario will almost inevitably lead to a collapse in investment among business and a surge in precautionary saving among customers, with fallout in the entire global economy from capital flight, the rapid and uncertain movement of large amounts of money out of a country, which tends to exacerbate economic crises. According to the OECD, the immediate yearly impact of the economy having been switched off could be a reduction in GDP in the G7 countries of between 20% and 30%. But again, this estimate depends on the outbreak's duration and severity in each country. The longer lockdowns last, the greater the structural damage they inflict by leaving permanent scars in the economy through job losses bankruptcies, and capital spending cancellations. As a rule of thumb, every month that large parts of an economy remain closed, annual growth might fall by a further 2 percentage points. But as we would expect, the relationship between the duration of restrictive measures and the corresponding impact on GDP is not linear. The Dutch Central Planning Bureau found that every additional month of containment results in a greater non-proportional deterioration of economic activity. According to the model, a full month of economic hibernation would result in a loss of 1.2% in Dutch growth in 2020, while 3 months would cause a 5% loss. For the regions and countries that have already exited lockdowns, it is too early to tell how GDP growth will evolve. At the end of June 2020, some V-shaped data, like the Eurozone Purchasing Manufacturing Indices, or PMI, and a bit of anecdotal evidence generated a stronger than expected rebound narrative, but we should not get carried away for 2 reasons. The marked improvement in PMI in the Eurozone and the US does not mean that these economies have turned the corner. It simply indicates that business activity has improved compared to previous months, which is natural since a significant pickup in activity should follow the period of inactivity caused by rigorous lockdowns. In terms of future growth, one of the most meaningful indicators to watch is the savings rate. In April, admittedly during the lockdown, the US personal savings rate climbed to 33%, while in the Eurozone, the household savings rate, calculated differently than the US personal savings rate, rose to 19%. They will both significantly drop as the economies reopen, but probably not enough to prevent these rates from remaining at historically elevated levels. In its World Economic Outlook update published in June 2020, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, warned about a crisis like no other and an uncertain recovery. Compared to April, it revised its projections for global growth downwards, anticipating global GDP at minus 4.9% in 2020, almost 2 percentage points below its previous estimate. Employment. The pandemic is confronting the economy with a labor market crisis of gigantic proportions. The devastation is such and so sudden as to leave even the most seasoned policymakers almost speechless, and worse still, nigh on policiness. In testimony before the US Senate Committee on Banking on 19th of May, the Federal Reserve System's chairman, Jerome J. Powell, confessed this precipitous drop in economic activity has caused a level of pain that is hard to capture in words. His lives are upended and there's great uncertainty about the future. In just the 2 months of March and April 2020, more than 36 million Americans lost their jobs, reversing 10 years of job gains. In the US, like elsewhere, temporary dismissals caused by the initial lockdowns may become permanent, inflicting intense social pain that only robust social safety nets can alleviate, and profound structural damage to countries' economies. The level of global unemployment will ultimately depend on the depth of the collapse in economic activity. If hovering around or exceeding 2-digit levels across the world are a given. In the US, a harbinger of difficulties to come elsewhere. It is estimated that the official rate of unemployment could reach a peak of 25% in 2020, a level equivalent to that of the Great Depression. That would be even higher if hidden unemployment were taken into account, like workers who are not counted in official statistics because they are so discouraged they abandon the workforce and cease looking for a job, or part-time workers who are looking for a full-time job. The situation of employees in the service industry will be particularly dire. That of workers not officially employed will be even worse. As for GDP growth, the magnitude and severity of the unemployment situation are country dependent. Each nation will be affected differently, depending on its economic structure and the nature of its social life. But the US and Europe offer two radically different models of how the issue is being addressed by policymakers and of what lies ahead. As of June 2020, the rise in the US unemployment rate, it stood at a mere 3.5% prior to the pandemic, was much higher than anywhere else. In April 2020, the US unemployment rate had risen by 11.2 percentage points compared to February, while during the same period in Germany, it had increased by less than 1 percentage point. Two reasons account for this striking difference. One, the US labor market has a hire and fire culture that doesn't exist and is often prohibited by law in Europe. And two, right from the onset of the crisis, Europe put into place fiscal measures destined to support employment. In the US, government support so far, June 2020, has been larger than in Europe, but of fundamentally different nature. It provides income support for those who lost their job, with the occasional result that those displaced are better off than in their full-time jobs before the crisis. In Europe, by contrast, the governments decided to directly support those businesses that kept workers formerly employed in their original jobs, even when they were no longer working full-time or not working at all. In Germany, the short-time working scheme called Kurzarbeit, a model emulated elsewhere, replaced up to 60% of earnings for 10 million employees who would have otherwise lost their jobs, while in France, a similar scheme also compensated a similar number of workers by providing them with up to 80% of their previous salary. Many other European countries came up with similar solutions, without which layoffs and redundancies would have been much more consequential. These labour market supporting measures are accompanied by other government security emergency measures, like those giving insolvent companies possibility to buy time. In many European countries, if firms can prove that their liquidity problems were caused by the pandemic, they won't have to file for bankruptcy until later, possibly as late as March 2021. This makes eminent sense if the recovery takes hold, but it could be that this policy is only postponing the problem. Globally, full recovery of the labour market could take decades, and in Europe, like elsewhere, the fear of mass bankruptcies followed by mass unemployment looms large. In the coming months, the unemployment situation is bound to deteriorate further for the simple reason that it cannot improve significantly till the sustainable economic recovery ends. This won't happen before a vaccine or a treatment is found, meaning that many people will be doubly worried about losing their job and not finding another one if they do leave. which will lead to a sharp increase in savings rates. In a slightly more distant time, from a few months to a few years, two categories of people will face particularly bleak employment situation. Young people entering for the first time a job market devastated by the pandemic, and workers susceptible to be replaced by robots. These are fundamental issues at the intersection of economics, society, and technology, with defining implications for the future of work. Automation, in particular, will be a source of acute concern. The economic case that technology always exerts positive economic effect in the long term is well known. The substance of the argument goes like this. Automation is disruptive, but it improves productivity and increases wealth for the rich, which in turn lead to greater demands for goods and services, thus to new type of jobs satisfy those demands. To a point. This is correct, but what happens between now and the long term? In all likelihood, the recession induced by the pandemic will trigger a sharp increase in labor substitution, meaning that physical labor will be replaced by robots and intelligent machines, which will in turn provoke lasting and structural changes in the labor market. In the technology chapter, we analyze in more detail the impact that the pandemic is having on automation, but there is already ample evidence that it is accelerating the pace of transformation. The call center sector epitomizes this situation. In the pre-pandemic era, new artificial intelligence-based technologies were being gradually introduced to automate some of the tasks performed by human employees. The COVID-19 crisis and its accompanying measures of social distancing has suddenly accelerated this process of innovation and technological change. Chatbots, which often use the same voice recognition technology behind Amazon's Alexa and other software that can replace tasks normally performed by human employees, are being rapidly introduced. These innovations, provoked by necessity, i.e., sanitary measures, will soon result in the hundreds of thousands, and potentially millions of job losses. As consumers may prefer automated services, face-to-face interactions for some time to come. What is currently happening with call centers will inevitably occur in other sectors as well. Automation anxiety therefore set for a revival, which the economic recession will exacerbate. The process of automation is never linear. It tends to happen in waves and often in harsh economic times, when the decline in companies' revenues makes labor costs relatively more expensive. This is when employers replace less skilled workers with automation to increase labor productivity. Low-income workers and routine jobs in manufacturing and services like food and transportation are those most likely to be affected. The labor market will become increasingly polarized between highly paid work and lots of jobs that have disappeared or aren't well paid and are not very interesting. In emerging and developing countries, particularly those that their youth bulge, technology runs the risk of transforming a demographic dividend into a demographic nightmare, because automation will make it much harder to get on the escalator of economic growth. It is easy to give way to excessive pessimism because we human beings find it much easier to visualize what is disappearing than what is coming next. We know and understand that levels of unemployment are bound to rise globally in the foreseeable future, but over the coming years and decades, we may be surprised. We could witness an unprecedented wave of innovation, creativity driven by new methods and tools of production. There might also be a global explosion of hundreds of thousands of new micro industries that will hopefully employ hundreds of millions of people. Of course, we cannot know what the future holds, except that much will depend on the trajectory of future economic growth. So that's that section. The other section here, let me see how long it takes. Um, yeah, I should be able to finish this. Should be able to finish this entire chapter. Yeah, easy. Oh, okay. So let's put the bookmark in, and I'm going to roll on with this. Let's check that. Things. So just while I'm rolling this, my intention with with writing a digest on like the Wide Australia Party, the NSN's new little project. Um, I I won't be trying to appeal to people on the left. I will be trying to appeal to people on the right who are not Nazis. Who are not obviously, I mean, no point appealing to Nazis. Really, it's kind of, for the most part, they're too far gone. Once they get to that point, if they're denying the Holocaust and LARPing Hitler and all that, it's you can't really save them. Yeah, it'll be very much an appeal to um, Australian conservatives, not so much Australian progressives, though I may have a word or two on that front. Because my main concern with regards to appealing to conservatives is those conservatives who might vote for this party not realizing what they are. Like, yeah, I will. Well, I'm writing a digest, so so I'll leave it for that. All right, let's keep going. What future economic growth could look like in the post-pandemic era? According to current projections, the new economic normal may be characterized by much lower growth than in past decades. As the recovery begins, quarter to quarter GDP growth may look impressive because it will start from a very low basis, but it may take years before the overall size of most nations' economy returns to their pre-pandemic level. This is also due to the fact that the severity of the economic shock inflicted by the coronavirus will conflate with a long-term trend. Declining populations in many countries and aging. Demographics is destiny and a crucial driver of GDP growth. Under such conditions, when lower economic growth seems almost certain, many people may wonder whether obsessing about growth is even useful, concluding that it doesn't make sense to chase a target of ever higher GDP growth. No fucking shit. I mean, communists like moi have been saying that for almost 2 centuries at this point. The deep disruption caused by COVID-19 globally has offered societies an enforced pause to reflect on what is truly of value. With the economic emergency responses to the pandemic now in place, the opportunity can be seized to make the kind of institutional changes and policy choices that will put economies on a new path towards a fairer, greener future. The history of radical rethinking in the years following World War II, which included the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, the EU, and the expansion of welfare states, shows the magnitude of the shifts possible. This raises two questions. One, what should the new compass for tracking progress be? And two, what will the new drivers of an economy that is inclusive and sustainable be? In relation to the first question, changing course will require a shift in the mindset of world leaders, place greater focus and priority on the well-being of all citizens of the planet. Historically, national statistics were amazed principally furnish governments with a better understanding of the available resources for taxation and waging war. As democracies grew stronger, In the 1930s, the remit of national statistics was extended to capture the economic welfare of the population, yet distilled into the form of GDP. Economic welfare became equivalent to current production and consumption, with no consideration given to future availability of resources. Policymakers' over-reliance on GDP as an indicator of economic prosperity has led to the current state of natural and social resource depletion. I'm sorry, but based? based, based take? What other elements should an improved dashboard for progress include? First, GDP itself needs to be updated to reflect the value created in the digital economy, the value created through unpaid work, as well as the value potentially destroyed through certain types of economic activity. The omission of value created through work carried out in the household has been a long-standing issue, and research efforts to create a measurement framework will need new momentum. In addition, as the digital economy is expanding, the gap between measured activity and actual economic activity has been growing wider. Furthermore, certain types of financial products, which through their inclusion in GDP are captured as value creating, are merely shifting value from one place to another, or sometimes even have the effect of destroying. Second, it is not only the overall size of the economy that matters, but also the distribution of gains and the progressive evolution of access to opportunity. With income inequality more marked than ever in many countries and technological developments further driving polarization, total GDP or averages such as GDP per capita are becoming less and less useful as true indicators of individuals' quality of life. Wealth inequality is a significant dimension of today's dynamic of inequality and should be more systematically tracked. Third, resilience will need to be better measured and monitored to gauge the true health of an economy, including the determinants of productivity, such as institutions, infrastructure, human capital, and innovation ecosystems, which are critical for the overall strength of the system. Furthermore, the capital reserves upon which a country can draw in times of crisis, including financial, physical, natural, and social capital, will need to be tracked systematically. Albeit that natural and social capital in particular are difficult to measure, they are critical to the social cohesion and environmental sustainability of a country and should not be underestimated. Recent academic efforts are beginning to tackle the measurement challenge by bringing public and private sector data sources together. Real examples of a shift in policymakers' emphasis are appearing. It is no coincidence that in 2019, a country placed in the top 10 ranking of the World Happiness Report unveiled a well-being budget. The Prime Minister of New Zealand's decision to earmark money for social issues such as mental health, child poverty, family violence, made well-being an explicit goal of public policy. In so doing, Prime Minister Ardern turned into policy what everybody had known for years, that an increase in GDP does not guarantee an improvement in living standards and social welfare. Oh shit. Additionally, several institutions and organizations, ranging from cities to the European Commission, are reflecting on operations that would sustain future economic activity at a level that matches the satisfaction of our material needs with the respect of our planetary boundaries. The municipality of Amsterdam is the first in the world to have formally committed to this framework as a starting point for public policy decisions in the post-pandemic world. The framework resembles a donut in which the inner ring represents the minimum we need to lead a good life, as enunciated by the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and the outer ring, the ecological ceiling defined by Earth system scientists, which highlights the boundaries not to be crossed by human activity to avoid environmentally negative impact on climate, soil, oceans, the ozone layer, fresh water, and biodiversity. In between the two rings is the sweet spot, or dough, where our human needs and those of the planet are being met. We do not know yet whether the tyranny of GDP growth will come to an end, but different signals suggest that the pandemic may accelerate changes in many of our well-entrenched social norms. If we collectively recognize that, beyond a certain level of wealth defined by GDP per capita, happiness depends more on intangible factors such as accessible healthcare and a robust social fabric than on material consumption, then values as different as the respect for the environment, responsible eating, empathy, or generosity may gain ground and progressively come to characterize the new social norms. Beyond the immediate ongoing crisis, in recent years, the role of economic growth in advancing living standards has varied depending on context. In high income economies, productivity growth has been steadily declining since the 1970s, and it has been argued that there are currently no clear policy avenues for reviving long term growth. In addition, the growth that did materialize disproportionately accrued to individuals at the top end of the income distribution. There's neoliberalism for you. A more effective approach may be for policymakers to target welfare enhancing interventions more directly. In low and middle income countries, the benefits of economic growth have lifted millions out of poverty in large emerging markets. The policy options to boost growth performance are better known, e.g., addressing basic distortions. Yet new approaches will have to be found as the manufacturing led development model is fast losing its power with the advent of the fourth industrial revolution. This leads to the second key question around future growth. If the direction and quality of economic growth matter as much as, or perhaps even more than, its speed, what are likely to be the new drivers of this quality in the post-pandemic economy? Several areas have the potential to offer an environment capable of boosting a more inclusive and sustainable dynamism. The green economy spans a range of possibilities from greener energy to ecotourism to the circular economy. For example, shifting from the take, make, dispose approach to production and consumption to a model that is restorative and regenerative by design can preserve resources and minimize waste by using a product again when it reaches the end of its useful life, thus creating further value that can in turn generate economic benefits by contributing to innovation, job creation, and ultimately growth. Companies and strategies that favor reparable products with longer lifespans, from phones and cars to fashion, that even offer free repairs like Patagonia outdoor wear, and platforms for trading used products are all expanding fast. The social economy spans other high growth and job creating areas, fields of caregiving, personal services, education, and health. Investment in childcare, care for the elderly, and other elements of the care economy would create 13 million jobs in the US alone and 21 million jobs in 7 economies, and would lead to a 2% rise in GDP growth in the countries studied. Education is also an area of massive job creation, particularly when considering primary and secondary education, technical and vocational education and training, university and adult training together. Health, as the pandemic has demonstrated, requires much greater investment both in terms of infrastructure and innovation, as well as human capital. These three areas create a multiplier effect both through their own employment potential and the long-term benefits they unleash across societies in terms of equality, social mobility, and inclusive growth. Innovation in production, distribution, and business models can generate efficiency gains and new or better products that create higher value added, leading to new jobs and economic prosperity. Governments thus have tools at their disposal to make the shift towards more inclusive and sustainable prosperity, combining public sector direction setting and incentives with commercial innovation capacity through a fundamental rethinking of markets and their role in our economy and society. This requires investing differently and deliberately in the frontier markets outlined above, areas where market forces could have a transformative effect on economies and societies, but where some of the necessary preconditions to function are still lacking. For instance, technical capabilities to sustainably produce a product or asset at scale are still insufficient. Standards are not well defined, legal frameworks are not yet well developed. Shaping the rules and mechanisms of these new markets can have a transformational impact on the economy. If governments want the shift to a new and better kind of growth, they have a window of opportunity to act now to create incentives for innovation and creativity in the areas outlined above. Some have called for degrowth, a movement that embraces zero or even negative GDP growth that is gaining some traction, at least in the richest countries. As the critique of economic growth moves to center stage, consumerism's financial and cultural dominance in public and private life will be overhauled. This is made obvious in consumer-driven degrowth activism in some niche segments, like advocating for less meat or fewer flights. By triggering a period of enforced degrowth, pandemic has spurred renewed interest in this movement that wants to reverse the pace of economic growth, leading more than 1,100 experts from around the world to release a manifesto in May 2020, putting forward a degrowth strategy to tackle the economic and human crisis caused by COVID-19. Their open letter calls for the adoption of a democratically planned yet adaptive, sustainable, and equitable downscaling of the economy, leading to a future where we can live better with less. However, beware of the pursuit of degrowth proving as directionless as the pursuit of growth. The most forward-looking countries and their governments will instead prioritize a more inclusive and sustainable approach to managing and measuring their economies, one that also drives job growth, improvements in living standards, and safeguards the planet. The technology to do more with less already exists. There is no fundamental trade-off between economic, social, and environmental factors if we adopt this more holistic and longer-term approach to defining progress and incentivizing investment in green and social frontier markets. Okay, so the next bit will be 1.2.3. How long did this take to read? Yeah, I'll read section. 1.2.3 Fiscal and Monetary Policies. The fiscal and monetary policy response to the pandemic has been decisive, massive, swift. In systemically important countries, central banks decided almost immediately after the beginning of the outbreak to cut interest rates while launching large quantitative easing programs, committing to print the money necessary to keep the costs of government borrowing low. The US Fed undertook to buy Treasury bonds and agency mortgage-backed securities, while the European Central Bank promised to buy any instrument that governments would issue. A move that succeeded in reducing the spread borrowing costs between weaker, stronger Eurozone members. Concomitantly, most governments launched ambitious and unprecedented fiscal policy responses. Urgent and expansive measures were taken very early on during the crisis, with three specific aims. One, fight the pandemic with as much spending as required to bring it under control as rapidly as possible through the production of tests, hospital capabilities, research in drugs and vaccines, etc. Two, provide emergency funds to households and firms on the verge of bankruptcy and disaster. And three, support aggregate demand so that the economy can operate as far as possible close to potential. These measures will lead to very large fiscal deficits, with a likely increase in debt to GDP ratios 30% of GDP for rich economies. At the global level, the aggregate stimulus from government spending will likely exceed 20% of global GDP 2020, with significant variation across countries, ranging from 33% Germany to more than 12% in the US. This expansion of fiscal capabilities has dramatically different implications depending on whether the country concerned is advanced or emerging. High income countries have more fiscal space because a higher level of debt should prove sustainable and entail a viable level of welfare costs for future generations. For two reasons. One, the commitment from central banks to purchase whatever amount of bonds it takes to maintain low interest rates. And two, the confidence that interest rates are likely to remain low in the foreseeable future because uncertainty will continue, hampering private investment and will justify high levels of cautionary savings. In contrast, the situation couldn't be starker in emerging and developing economies. Most of them don't have the fiscal space required to react to the pandemic shock. They are already suffering from major capital outflows, fall in commodity prices, which means their exchange rate will be hammered if they decide to launch expansionary fiscal policies. In these circumstances, help in the form of grants and debt relief, and possibly an outright moratorium, will not only be needed, but will be critical. These are unprecedented programs for an unprecedented situation. Something so new that the economist Carmen Reinhardt has called it a whatever it takes moment for large scale, outside the box fiscal and monetary policies. Measures that would have seemed inconceivable prior to the pandemic may well become standard around the world as governments try to prevent the economic recession from turning into a catastrophic depression. Increasingly, there will be calls for government to act as a payer of last resort, prevent or stem the spate of mass layoffs and business destruction triggered by the pandemic. All these changes are altering the rules of the economic and monetary policy game. The artificial barrier that makes monetary and fiscal authorities independent from each other has now been dismantled, with central bankers becoming, to a relative degree, subservient to elected politicians. It is now conceivable that, in the future, government will try to wield its influence over central banks to finance major public projects such as an infrastructure or green investment fund. Similarly, the precept that government can intervene, preserve worker jobs or incomes, and protect companies from bankruptcy may endure after these policies come to an end. It is likely that public political pressure to maintain such schemes persist, even when the situation improves. One of the greatest concerns is that this implicit cooperation between fiscal and monetary policies leads to uncontrollable inflation. It originates in the idea that policymakers will deploy massive fiscal stimulus that will be fully monetized, i.e., not financed through standard government debt. This is where modern monetary theory and helicopter money come in. With interest rates hovering around zero, central banks cannot stimulate the economy by classic monetary tools, i.e., a reduction in interest rates, unless they decided to go for deeply negative interest rates, a problematic move resisted by most central banks. The stimulus must therefore come from an increase in fiscal deficits, meaning that public expenditure will go up at a time when tax revenues decline. Put in the simplest possible, and in this case simplistic terms, MMT runs like this. Governments will issue some debt that a central bank will buy. If it never sells it back, it equates to monetary finance. The deficit is monetized by the central bank purchasing the bonds the government issues, and the government can use the money as it sees fit. It can, for example, metaphorically drop it from helicopters to those people in need. The idea is appealing and realizable, but it contains a major issue of social expectations and political control. Once citizens realize that money can be found on a magic money tree, elected politicians will be under fierce and relentless public pressure to create more and more, which is when the issue of inflation kicks in. Yes, that is the big problem with modern monetary theory that I am aware of. There does need to be some care taken, otherwise we'll end up in inflation. Deflation or inflation? Two technical elements embedded in the issue of monetary finance are associated with the risk of inflation. First, the decision to engage in perpetual quantitative easing, i.e., in monetary finance, doesn't have to be taken when the central bank buys the debt issued by the government. It can be left to the contingent future to hide or circumvent the idea that money grows on trees. Second, the inflationary impact of helicopter money is not related to whether the deficit is funded or unfunded, but is directly proportional to the amount of money involved. There are no nominal limits to how much money the central bank can create, but there are sensible limits to how much they would want to create to achieve reflation without risking too much inflation. The resultant increase in nominal GDP will be split between a real output effect and an increase in price level. This balance and its inflationary nature will depend on how tight the supply constraints are, so ultimately on the amount of money created. Central bankers may decide there is nothing to worry about with inflation at 2% or 3%, and that 4% or to 5% is also fine. They will have to define upper limit at which inflation becomes disruptive and a real concern. The challenge will be to determine at what level inflation becomes corrosive and a source of obsessive concern for consumers. For the moment, some fear deflation while others worry about inflation. What lies behind these divergent anxieties for the future? The deflation warriors point to a collapsing labor market and stumbling commodity prices, and wonder how inflation could possibly pick up anytime soon. Conditions. Inflation warriors observe the substantial increases in central bank balance sheets and fiscal deficits and ask how these will not one day lead to inflation and possibly high inflation and even hyperinflation. They point to the example of Germany after World War I, which inflated away its domestic war debt in the hyperinflation of 1923, or the UK, which eroded with a bit of inflation the massive amount of debt, 250% inherited from World War II. These warriors acknowledge that in the short term, deflation may be a bigger risk, but argue that inflation is ultimately unavoidable given the massive and inevitable amounts of stimulus. At this current juncture, it is hard to imagine how inflation could pick up at once. The reshoring of production activities would generate occasional pockets of inflation, but they are likely to remain limited. The combination of potent long-term structural trends like aging and technology, both are deflationary, and an exceptionally high unemployment rate that will constrain wage increases for years, puts strong downward pressure on inflation. In the post-pandemic era, strong consumer demand is unlikely. The pain inflicted by widespread unemployment, lower incomes for large segments of the population, and uncertainty about the future are all likely to lead to an increase in precautionary savings. When social distancing eventually eases, pent-up demand could provoke a bit of inflation, but it is likely to be temporary and will therefore not affect inflation expectations. Oliver Blanchard, the former chief economist of the IMF, thinks that only the combination of the following three elements could create inflation. 1. A very large increase in the debt to GDP ratio, larger than the current forecast of 20 to 30%. 2. A very large increase in the neutral rate, i.e., the safe real rate required to keep the economy at potential. And 3. Fiscal dominance of monetary policy. The probability of each individually is already low, so the probability of the three occurring in conjunction with each other is extremely low, but not nil. Bond investors think alike. This could change, of course, but at the moment, the low rate differential between nominal and inflation indexed bonds paints a picture of ongoing very low inflation at best. In the coming years, high income countries may well face a situation similar to that of Japan over the past few decades. Structurally weak demand, very low inflation, and ultra low interest rates. The possible Japanification of the rich world is often depicted as a hopeless combination of no growth, no inflation, and insufferable debt levels. This is misleading. When the data is adjusted for demographics, Japan does better than most. Its GDP per capita is high and growing, and since 2007, its real GDP per member of the working age population has risen faster than in any other G7 country. Naturally, there are many idiosyncratic reasons for this. A very high level of social capital and trust, but also labor productivity growth surpasses the average and a successful absorption of elderly workers into the labor force. But it shows that a shrinking population doesn't have to lead to economic oblivion. Japan's high living standards and well-being indicators offer a salutary lesson that there is hope in the face of economic hardship. Let me just see. Ooh, that'll be an interesting. Yeah, okay. Finish this section. The fate of the US dollar. This will be an interesting one to read in hindsight. For decades, the US has enjoyed the exorbitant privilege of retaining the global currency reserve, a status that has long been a perk of imperial might and an economic elixir. To a considerable extent, American power and prosperity have been built and reinforced by the global trust in the dollar and the willingness of customers abroad to hold it, most often in the form of US government bonds. The fact that so many countries and foreign institutions want to hold dollars as a store of value and as an instrument of exchange for trade has anchored its status as the global reserve currency. This has enabled the US to borrow cheaply abroad and benefit from low interest rates at home, which in turn has allowed Americans to consume beyond their means. It has also made large recent US government deficits, permitted the US to run substantial trade deficits, reduced the exchange rate risk, and made the US financial markets more liquid. At the core of the US dollar status as a reserve currency lies a critical issue of trust. Non-Americans who hold dollars trust that the United States will protect both its own interests by managing sensibly its economy and the rest of the world as far as the US dollar is concerned, by managing sensibly in currency, like providing dollar liquidity to the global financial system efficiently and rapidly. For quite some time, some analysts and policymakers have been considering a possible and progressive end to the dominance of the dollar. They now think that the pandemic might be the catalyst that proves them right. Their argument is twofold and relates to both sides of the trust issue. On the one hand, managing the economy sensibly, doubters of US dollar dominance point to the inevitable and sharp deterioration of the US fiscal position. In their mind, unsustainable levels of debt will eventually erode confidence in the US dollar. Just prior to the pandemic, US defense spending, plus interest on the federal debt, plus annual entitlement payments, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, represented 112% of federal tax receipts. versus 95% in 2017. This unsustainable path will worsen in the post-pandemic, post-bailout era. This argument suggests that something major will therefore have to change, either through a much-produced geopolitical role or higher taxation, or both. Otherwise, the rising deficit will reach a threshold beyond which non-US investors are unwilling to fund it. After all, the status of reserve currency cannot last longer than foreign confidence in the ability of the holder to honor its payments. On the other hand, managing the US dollar sensibly for the rest of the world, doubters of the dollar's dominance point to the incompatibility of its status as a global reserve currency with rising economic nationalism at home. Even though the Fed and the US Treasury manage the dollar and its influential network worldwide with efficacy, skeptics emphasize the willingness of the US administration to weaponize the US dollar for geopolitical purposes, like punishing countries and companies that trade with Iran or North Korea, will inevitably incentivize dollar holders to look for alternatives. Are there any viable alternatives? The US remains a formidable global financial hegemon. The role of the dollar in international financial international financial transactions is far greater, albeit less visible, than in international trade. But it is also true that, that many countries would like to challenge the dollar's global dominance. In the short term, there are no alternatives. The Chinese renminbi could be an option, but not until strict capital controls are eliminated and the RMB turns into a market-determined currency, which is unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future. The same goes for the euro. It could be an option, but not until doubts about a possible implosion of the eurozone dissipate for good, which again is an unlikely prospect in the next years. As for a global virtual currency, there is none in sight yet, but there are attempts to launch national digital currencies that may eventually dethrone the US dollar supremacy. The most significant one took place in China at the end of April 2020 with the test of a national digital currency in 4 large cities. This is talking about, central bank digital currency. Is that what this is talking about? The country is years ahead of the rest of the world in developing a digital currency combined with powerful electronic payment platforms. This experiment clearly shows that there are monetary systems that are trying to become independent from US intermediaries while moving towards greater digitization. Ultimately, the possible end of the US dollar's primacy will depend on what happens in the US. As Henry Paulson, a former US Treasury Secretary, says, US dollar prominence begins at home. The United States must maintain an economy that inspires global credibility and confidence. Failure to do so will, over time, put the US dollar's position in peril. To a large extent, US global credibility also depends on geopolitics and the appeal of its social model. The exorbitant privilege is intricately intertwined with global power, perception of the US as a reliable partner, and its role in the working of multilateral institutions. If that role was seen as less sure, and that security guarantee as less ironclad because the US was disengaging from global geopolitics, in favor of more standalone, inward-looking policies, the security premium enjoyed by the US dollar could diminish, warns Barry, Eichengreen, and European Central Bank representatives. Questions and doubts about the future status of the dollar as a global currency reserve are an apt reminder that economics does not exist in isolation. This reality is particularly harsh in over-indebted emerging and poor countries, now unable to repay their debt, often denominated in dollars. For them, this crisis will take on huge proportions and years to sort out, with considerable economic damage translating fast into social and humanitarian pain. In all these countries, the COVID crisis may well end the gradual process of convergence that was supposed to bring highly developed and emerging or developing countries into closer alignment. This will lead to an increase in societal and geopolitical risks, a stark reminder of the extent to which economic risks intersect societal issues and geopolitics. And that'll bring us to Societal Reset 1.3. But I will leave that for next time. I don't want this to go on too long. But yeah, so that will be it for today. I will continue reading next Tuesday, obviously. Start reading 1.3 and go from there. It's interesting how it talks about like because yes, de-dollarization has accelerated, especially as a result of Trump's current policies in his second term. Like de-dollarization is happening fast. I mean, China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS and all these things. Like Trump is accelerating multipolarity. Now, what I fear is that this decline is going to bring about a quite profound swing in the other direction at some point, which will be that isolationism will begin to reduce and the United States might start becoming aggressive again. And that is something that's been looked at, how it seems like the decline of American empire has sort of brought the US back into a new version of like an older version of itself. The US has always been a violent nation, geopolitically and geopolitically in particular. But there is a point where I think it's going to come to the point where the decolonization which happened in the 20th century, most of which was incentivized by the anti-colonial nature of the subject. It did just give way to neocolonialism, which is like a different beast. But it does look like the way Trump was talking at the start, he's kind of stopped talking about it to a certain degree that I've noticed. But the idea of like a return to more traditional forms of colonialism and expansion, that is a concern. Now, the stuff about Canada is the concern would be like Central and South America, Caribbean, issues with Venezuela and Cuba. At the end of the day, we'll see how these things go, but I'm not liking the way it's looking. And it's looking increasingly bad. And that is not to even mention the factor that Israel is playing in making things so much worse. The genocide, the genocide, the increasing the greater Israel expansionist uh, project beginning to become mainstream again. It seems like what is going to happen with both the US and Israel, they're going to become increasingly expansionist, increasingly violent, and it's probably not going to end well for us, especially in the case of Israel, where if they start a big war and they start to get overrun, the specter of the Samson option looms large as a potential big threat. Now, the Samson option is their last resort nuclear deterrent strategy, which is basically to fire all their nukes. That's basically what it is. If they are on the verge of destruction, fire all the nukes. It is quite literally a we go down, everybody goes down mindset. It is destructive, it is violent, it is genocidal, and wouldn't end well, especially given that I've heard that some interpretations of the Samson option include nuking European cities like Rome and Berlin that have been historically associated with anti Semitism. If that's true, and that ends up being what happens, that is going to start a whole shit fight. That is not going to end well for any of us. So we'll see how things go. I am trying to monitor the situation as much as I can, but it's a bit hard. But yeah, I am going to leave it here for now. I will be in a cabin on Thursday, drink driving, Sonic Racing Crossroads. So we will see how that goes. See how drunk I get. See how I drive. um, but yeah, so for those who just do the reading groups, I'll be back to reading The Great Reset next Tuesday. Um, Otherwise, I will see you on Thursday for the gaming stream. See you guys later.